50 years ago, I didn't know I promised to love, honor, and substitute, but I'm Ed today. Reading from the book of Isaiah, chapter 35, verses 1 through 10. The desert and the dry land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom like a crocus. They will burst into bloom and rejoice with joy and singing. They will receive the glory of Lebanon, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the Lord's glory, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and support the unsteady knees. Say to those who are panicking, be strong, don't fear. Here's your God coming with vengeance, with divine retribution. God will come to save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened and the ears of the deaf will be cleared. Then the lame will leap like the deer and the tongue of the speechless will sing. Waters will spring up in the desert and streams in the wilderness. The burning sand will become a pool and the thirsty ground fountains of water. The jackal's habitat a pasture. Grass will become reeds and rushes. A highway will be there. It will be called the Holy Way. The unclean won't travel on it, but it will be for those walking on that way. Even fools won't get lost on it. No lion will be there, and no predator will go up on it. None of these will be there. Only the redeemed will walk on it. The Lord's ransomed ones will return and enter Zion with singing, with everlasting joy upon their hearts. Happiness and joy will overwhelm them. Grief and groaning will flee away. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
I think that today's reading literally are beautiful words and wonderful words of life. Life springing forth in the desert, the dry places being made fertile, the predators and the wild animals driven away, a place where there are no fools walking who are lost, where no one is out of place, where all are being received and nourished and fed. These are life-giving words that were inevitably delivered to a tired and worn-out exiled people. Probably delivered by a tired and worn-out prophet. And now being commented on by a tired and worn-out preacher. So maybe the insights on the rest of them are really more of a reflection on me. When you travel 7 hours one way and 7 hours back on an overnight trip, sometimes you show up on Sunday morning just a little bit out. Yes, thank you. I might have gotten bleeped if I'd said that on the video, but you can say it. And I know the exiled people had to be tired, and yet God is offering this promise of freedom to come and a return home. And in my own travels, I thought a lot about their travels and what would it mean to the exiles to be coming home, and what would this message of God causing the desert to spring forth before them actually mean. Maybe I took a turn that's a little too literal, but I'm going to invite you to go there with me And as we get going, I've pulled up a graphic that Jeremy has integrated into our program, and I'll ask him to pull that up for us. If you're any good at your geography, you may recognize it. That's the modern East. And if you remember your elementary, or no, it's probably middle school social studies classes, you might even recognize that colored strip on the map as the Fertile Crescent, what we learned about in our early introductions to world history. And the Fertile Crescent, I was going to use my laser pointer, but I'm not sure it'll show on the screen. I think you can all see it, right? Our Fertile Crescent is this arc that begins at the tip of the Persian Gulf, flows upward with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, arcs around through what would be modern-day Syria and southeast Turkey, goes down the coast through what we know as Israel, and tucks into Egypt and the Nile River Valley. And it's fertile because it's either along the shores, where it receives the rains that come off of the waters, or it's along the banks of these mighty rivers that would overflow and flood the areas around them, creating fertile lands in which many crops could be grown, in which animals could be raised, and it could support the rise of great cities and civilizations. It is also the home of two of our peoples from today's story. The people of Israel, who you can see along the coast of the Mediterranean, and their captors in Babylon, over here on the map where you see the label of Mesopotamia. In fact, right about near the O or the P in Mesopotamia, if you can read it, that would be the city of Babylon, modern-day Baghdad, the home of the exiles who had been spirited away from their lands after their nation had fallen to the armies of Babylon. And they were kept there, in effect, as hostages, to make sure that the remaining 90-some-odd% of the people in the land of Israel would remain calm, would remain subdued, and would not rise up to revolt against their new imperial overlords. And we know that these 10%, some of the richest of the rich, the religious leaders, the political leaders who were brought into this captivity, were kept isolated from their homeland and their people. And they struggled to maintain their identity as people of Yahweh, of Israel, surrounded by the people and gods of Babylon. They struggled watching their children grow up without the fellowship of their wider land, without the benefit of the temple that they would have once worshipped in that had since been destroyed, without the benefit of being in their own land and surrounded by people who spoke their own language and adhered to their own customs and beliefs. So I imagine they grew tired as year by year went by, as older adults watched their children become more distant to their culture and their customs. And they waited and they wondered, how long, oh God, how long? And then Isaiah comes along with a message of soon, soon. And here's how it's going to work. The land will open up before you. The dry spaces will be made fertile. God will go before you and make a way. It will be the highway of your Lord. And I wondered at that. And I thought, is Isaiah telling us that the people of Israel are literally going to cut through that Syrian desert on our map? Is God going to open up the soil and cause the ground to bloom forth before them? Admittedly, the farmer in me said, that's a tall order even for God. And the historian in me said, nah, it's probably more likely that on their return, they'll travel the safe route through the ark. They'll travel north through what's labeled as Assyria on your map and into Phoenicia, and then go down the coast as they return to their people. And we know this because they would have went with an escort from their new overlords. They were going home in freedom because the Assyrian army, or not the Assyrian armies, rather the Persian armies, had marched on Babylon and had captured the city and left their empire in ruins. And in doing so, they became the new rulers of not only Babylon, but the land of Israel. And they became the new overlords of the people. And we know that they were being sent back to their land not only to return home, gift of wealth, to rebuild their temple. They went home with the protection of the empire of Persia. They would have traveled on known roads, along known paths, and with an escort from their new overlords, knowing that the purpose of sending them home and rebuilding their temple was to let everyone know that Israel's God had placed divine blessing on Persia, being the new ruler of the Fertile Crescent and the Middle East. So I doubt they would have cut cross-country through the desert. They would have gone through lands that were already green and fertile, that were already safe for travel, that would not have left them struggling to make their way. So what exactly is God telling them, and by extension us, in this passage today? Is it simply poetic? Is it metaphor? Is it something more? As I was looking at the map again, I was noting, for any of you who are familiar with your geography of modern-day Israel, you'll know that there is a strip along the coast that is very fertile for the reasons that you see on the map. But as you push further inland and up into the hills, it becomes drier and more arid. There are spaces that are like desert. It would be harder to raise your crops, to allow your animals to graze. You have to put in the work to make this land fertile. And I was reminded of a good friend from my ministry in Oklahoma, Tom Lewis. He described himself as a street minister. He was a social worker who had worked independent of the Cherokee Nation tribal structures to create a much-needed shelter for homeless men in Tahlequah. We had a shelter similar to the YWCA Alive that I mentioned in our prayers for women and children. We had another shelter for women, but there were no place for the men. So he raised up the funds and gathered support from the nation, from the state, and from local benefactors, and created an alliance of churches, which I was proud that First Christian in Tahlequah, Oklahoma was a part of. And they were able to acquire the land and a building to create this shelter. And one of the projects that he began to embark upon was trying to help them obtain life skills and training and help them find a discipline they may have lost after what could have been months, even years, living outside of homes and on the streets. And so he built up gardens on the property there, and we partnered with him as well, and we built a garden on the church grounds. And Tom brought with him his excitement for what he called the Israeli drip system. It's not as dramatic as it sounds. We actually have some of that equipment out here watering our own gardens. But any of you who irrigate plants know that there are multiple ways to make sure the water gets to the plants. One of which is you set out your big sprayers and you just let it fly. But when you're in very dry places with high temperatures and lots of sunlight, if you throw that water out through the air to let it land on the grass and the plants, it begins to evaporate very quickly. And rather than seeping into the ground where you need it to be to make your soil fertile so your plants can grow, more of it ends up evaporating off into the air. So to get the amount of water you need in dry and arid climates, you waste huge amounts of water if you were to spray it through the air. The way you make sure that your water delivery system is as efficient as possible is you deliver it directly onto the ground. And if you're being very precise, you deliver it right at the roots of each individual plant. As Israel began making settlements into dry and arid areas, they brought with them this technology for delivering very efficient irrigation directly to the plants. Because they knew if they had cast their irrigation systems into the air, they would lose over half of their water just to the burning daylight of the sun. And these systems are devised by running tubes out through your plants. If you had 2 rows of, say, beanstalks, you would run a tube out down the first row and sweep back along the second. And where each plant is planted, you would add a small drip device. And you can put in devices that release different amounts of flow for different time periods, 1 gallon an hour, a ½ gallon an hour, 2 gallons an hour. Depending on the plant you are trying to irrigate, you give it the amount of water you need and you calculate how to give it exactly the right amount. So you turn your system on for 2 hours in the early morning before the sun even rises, and the water is delivered directly to the roots of the plants. It's a highly efficient way of making sure your plants have the water they need to grow and that you make the best use of the scarce resources before you. It's a modern-day equivalent of seeing the arid and dry lands being made to flourish and grow, to provide and feed for people. It's an image that I love, but it reminded me of what I think God may have been inviting the people into. And it wasn't a literal cross-country road trip, or in their case, walking trip, through the desert and through the dangers, but it was reminding them that when they find themselves in desert spaces, God has the power to transform them into places that give life. But I think God was also offering the message that this is not something that God does alone. God invites us to take part in raising up these fertile lands, in causing the plants to grow, in making the way safe, in creating a place where no one can grow lost. We play a part in that as well. As I was thinking on this irrigation metaphor, if the water is God's provision and God's love, do we simply let it fly out and land where it may, trusting it will do whatever good may be? Or what if we became the system by which God's love was focused to the roots of the plants that most needed it to grow? What if we became the people that helped create this way through the desert by causing plants to flourish in places where they should not otherwise grow, by causing the wild animals to become tame, by creating a way where no one will become lost because we are building up God's highway? What if God's story wasn't about a journey home at all, wasn't even about a destination, but was about the process and being on the way? That God's call was not to arrive at a destination, but to create that destination as we walked. What if the way of the Lord is a place where no one is lost because there is no destination in which to get lost? The way is simply finding yourself there and becoming part of God's plan, becoming a tender of God's field so that you help cause the plants to grow. You help make your neighbors safe. You help create God's garden in the desert. We do that in small ways, but we do that when we collect our change for the YWCA, and we help funnel God's love into a shelter for those who are fleeing violence and need God's protection and love most in those moments. We do that when we take meals to the coffee oasis and provide that dinner for youth and young adults who have no home to call their own and have no safe place or guarantee of a meal otherwise. We do that when we send gifts overseas, not even knowing which plants we are watering, to stay with the metaphor, but trusting that our partners there are doing amazing things. One of the greatest gifts I ever received over a decade ago was to travel in Bosnia and Herzegovina and see how our gifts to Week of Compassion, through our partnerships with Church World Service, who then partnered with local agencies on the ground, were creating jobs and providing opportunities. We're creating shelter for those without homes. We're raising up incubators where women who had lost their husbands and their sons in the war were able to start providing for themselves by crafting gifts and stoles. Unfortunately, I'm not wearing one of theirs. I'm wearing one of Sandy's today. But I have a stole in my collection that I bought there that was crafted at one of these collectives that we helped raise up and grow. I realize the title I gave you, The Gift of the Wilderness, it's so far bygone now. The gift isn't the wilderness. The gift is that we are called into it and can be a gift to others and can receive gifts from others. We know life is not simple. We know the way sometimes feels barren and empty. We find ourselves feeling like exiles, trapped in strange and foreign lands, wondering at what our children and grandchildren are learning as the world around us seems so foreign and different. But God reminds us that there is a way forward. There is a highway that will lead us to the promise. And the promise isn't a literal place. It's not the seats in this sanctuary. Doesn't mean I want you to stay home, but this isn't the promise. The way isn't your car ride here in the mornings. The way is trusting and knowing that God is with us and that through us, God is with others as well. Through those neighbors beyond our walls and through our prayers and support, we are the presence of God to each other as well. The gift might have been the wilderness when I dreamed this sermon up a couple weeks back, but today the gift is that we are present in the wilderness. We can cause the plants to grow and create a place and a way where no one is lost and all are safe and fed and welcomed and received. The gift of God is that we are the gift. So may we find the ways to continue to focus God's love so that we might cause others to flourish and grow around us as well. Amen? Amen. Amen.